right? All of this stems from this idea of failure. We fear that we're not going to fit in or be accepted by our peers or our colleagues, and that's, in a sense, a failure of sorts. And so we fear not living up to these expectations. An example, I actually wrote this lesson. I've gone back to it since then at 5 a.m. one morning because I woke up, I had a bad dream, I guess, and I woke up and I couldn't go back to sleep. I was so anxious. I was anxious about this. I was anxious that it was going to be terrible and that I wasn't going to do a good job, and so I just woke up and ended up writing it at 5 a.m. So you can tell me later if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You can tell me later. But as I was thinking through this, I wanted to look at failure and what defines it. And the definition of failure is to fall short of success or achievement in something expected, attempted, desired, or approved. To receive less than a passing grade, we recognize that one, I'm sure, from school. To be or become deficient or lacking, be insufficient or absent, or fall short. So these are the definitions of failure. And it got me thinking, who and what defines failure for us? So as we're so worried about failure, who has defined it or what has defined failure? Is it a person that's defined what it means to fail versus succeed for you? Is it an institution? So all of this leads kind of to whose expectations are we trying to live up to, right? Who sets this for us? So just off the top of your head, what are some of the things that kind of set the expectation of failure for us, potentially? Society, definitely. Who said that? Very good, thank you. Parents, okay. Professors, yeah, exactly. Ourselves. True. Facebook. That's a good one, that's a big one, yeah. So all of these things, and others, and I think it's different for each one of us, define what it means to fail or to succeed. And so that, as I think being aware of those things is really important, and then working to work through them and toward an understanding of how God views us and what God thinks of us, I think is kind of the goal for each one of us as we journey through this life. It can be really easy to simply take a few verses of scripture and say, this is what it means to succeed, right? This is what it means to live a Christian life. This is all you need to do. You don't need to fear. You just need to trust God all the time. And yes, we believe these things, right? We believe that we should have faith and trust God. Those are so important. But fear is something that we deal with every day. And it impacts us more than we probably realize. And I think everyone who's spoken so far, Brandon and Dave and Judy and Ron last week, have kind of recognized what we know we're supposed to do and believe and what our human nature is, right? And our fears that we struggle with. And so it's this battle that I think we constantly face because there is fear rooted within us. There's a TED Talk. I don't know where I would be without TED Talks, really, on certain topics. And it's by Tim Ferriss. I don't know much about him otherwise. But his video is called Why You Should Define Your Fears Instead of Your Goals. And so he says that humans are very good at considering what might go wrong if we try something new versus considering the cost of status quo, not changing anything. As we've all said so far, some fears are well-founded. Fear is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but we shouldn't conclude that they must dictate our lives until we put them under a microscope. So what he offers has, this has been through studying the Stoics and the literature of the Stoics. He argues that instead of writing out goals, we should write out our fears. And that we should work through them. And so one of his examples that he gives in his talk is that he had started a business and he knew that it was at a pivotal moment, that it could either thrive or crumble. And he knew that he needed to make a change and do something different. So he wanted to take this month-long trip to Europe because he could stay with a friend, it'd be really inexpensive, and he thought this could be really good for me. But his fears started to hold him back. And one of his fears was that the IRS would send him a letter, that he wouldn't get it, and that his business would be shut down. He feared that he would go on this trip, that the weather would just make him depressed, that it wouldn't do any good for him, like he had hoped that it would. So those are two of many, he said, fears that he had about going on this trip. And so he visualized the worst possible scenarios with those fears. And so then he makes columns, and if you go watch the video, it explains it better, but he writes through kind of ways that he could keep those things from happening. So if he gets a letter from the IRS, he could have it forwarded to his accountant who could handle it, right? He could take one of those lamps with him, because seasonal affective disorder is a real thing. He could take one of those lamps with him so that if he got depressed or down, then he would be able to maybe combat that. And if that happened, then he could just change locations. He could go somewhere sunny and nice instead if he needed to. And so he ended up taking the trip. And it turns out that it really helped him thrive. It helped his business. And he ended up taking a lot longer on this trip than he had originally intended. And so it ended up kind of launching his book that he wrote. Again, I don't know much about him other than this video, but it was one of the best things he'd ever done. And he almost didn't go because he had these fears about going. And so on the board, we looked at this last week, and the book talks a lot about this acronym. Face your fears with faith, examine your assumption in light of facts, attack your anxieties with action, and release your fears to God. So this is a theme throughout the whole book. And I was thinking that we can never actually do these things. And we talked about this a bit last week. We can never actually do these things if we spend more time in the media, and today, especially in social media, than we do in Scripture, than we do in community that's going to be healthy for us and beneficial for us. And so I love the idea last week of a media fast. This idea of taking time away from the media, not to where you're completely disconnected from the world, because we shouldn't be disconnected from what's going on, but to get away from it. And maybe even from social media, especially when we're talking about loneliness and insignificance and all of these things. But last week when we were looking at the list, which was so incredibly interesting to me, the list of media sources we use and don't use, and every single source was on both lists. You saw that, right? I mean, some people trust one and half the people don't, which is a really interesting place to be. But it made me think about, when we talked about this in a sermon a few months ago, about how much more time we spend in these media outlets than we do studying Scripture. And so if we're going to truly get an idea of what it means to succeed and to not fear, then we need to be spending more time in the Word than we do reading all these news sources and social media, especially. So in the book, Adam has 3 things that he points out in terms of this fear of failure, this kind of overarching fear of failure. They're up here on the board. The first one, most things are never as hard as you fear they will be. So going back to what I said about that video, if you actually think through your fears and take that risk, then most things are not going to be as hard. Successful people, and I should put that in quotes because again, different things define success for us, but successful people are willing to do things that unsuccessful people aren't willing to do. And then more often than not, choosing the harder, riskier, inconvenient path is the right choice. These are things that Adam talks about in his book, and if you've read it, I'm sure you've spent some time with those. The first thing, this first number, there's another TED Talk, like I said, I don't know where I'd be without them, by Karen Thompson Walker, and it's called What Fear Can Teach Us. And she tells a really incredible story that I'm not going to go into today, but you should definitely watch it. But one of her main points is that we are the only beings that can project our feelings into the future. Our imaginations are incredible. And you just think about a child and the imagination that they have and the stories that they come up with and the incredible fears that they come up with about monsters under their bed or in their closet and how they create this in their mind. That doesn't go away as we get older. So we're the only ones who can project these feelings into the future and make scenarios that may or may not, most likely not, happen. If you ask any person who's high up in their career about their journey to get there, chances are they've failed more times than they've succeeded, right? I mean, it's just, it is continuing to try when you failed that will get you where you want to be. And then the third point, more often than not, choosing the harder, riskier, inconvenient path is the right choice. And Adam goes into this idea that living is risking. And to live is to fail. We're going to fail at things. I mean, it's just going to happen to us. And so what we do with the perceived failure is the most important part. If we allow it to define us, that's where we have a real problem. But if we allow ourselves to learn from it and to move forward, then we will be successful. So take a few moments and speak with someone around you about these points. If you agree with them or disagree with them, if you read the book and what they made you think of as you read it. So just take a few moments and share your thoughts about these three. If you've experienced them, if you've experienced them to be true in your own life, just share those for a moment with someone next to you. I've been in the way everywhere I've stood in the past few minutes. It's been really unhelpful to you, I'm sure. Anything that you wish to share from your conversation with your neighbors?
Well, this is not my conversation because my neighbors don't speak. But the thing I thought about regarding number one, if you recall the statement that President Franklin Roosevelt made in the Second World War, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Yeah.
And that's really true.
Yeah. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Is the quote that he just lifted up. And how true that is. That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? Anything? Yes, Laura?
Well, the third statement reminded me of the sermon last week when he talked about those that followed Jesus went on an adventure.
Yeah.
They didn't take the easy way.
Right? Yeah. So Laura said that the sermon last week, this reminded her of that when I'm talking about the followers of Jesus taking an adventure, and not the easy way, but adventure has ups and downs and all kinds of twists and turns and unexpected things that may happen along it. So, very good. Anyone else? So in the book, Adam talks about, uses J.K. Rowling as an example. So you've probably read this. And as you know, she has sold over 400 million copies of the Harry Potter books, which is more than the people that live in our country. So that's pretty incredible to think about. But she was rejected by 12 publishers. So think about that. And now those publishers are all kicking themselves, obviously. They really missed out on that. So she was given an advance of $1,500 and told to get a day job. And she said that it is impossible to live without failing at something, unless you live so cautiously that you might as well not have lived at all, in which case you fail by default. I think the first step of getting over our fear of failure is realizing that there are going to be times when we fail. It's just part of life, and not to make it sound like it's not important or that there are not consequences to that. But if we recognize the universality of that, and that we all struggle with it, and none of us want to share times we failed because we don't want to feel insignificant, we don't want to disappoint others, we don't want to be alone. All these other fears come into that, right? And so we don't want to share our failures. And that just continues to add to the stigma around failure and what it means for us. So think of a time when you have failed at something. We're not going to go around and share these. Talk again. So think about a time when you've failed at something, or that's been kind of the perception of what's happened in that position. And think about what the consequences of. What were the consequences of that failing? Were they as extreme as you anticipated that they would be? So one of the things in the ordination process that happens oftentimes to a lot of clergy is that at some point along the way you get deferred. So it's not a no, but it's you're going to wait a year and we'll see what happens, and then you'll come back. And so in 2011, I got deferred. And I don't like to tell people that because I said, it feels like a failure. But there's so many clergy who that's happened to. And so it sets up this incredible, just this expectation or this misunderstanding of the process, or this really competitive and not healthy environment for folks as they're going through the process. And so, but once it happens, then other people come out and tell you that it's happened to them too. And turns out that was the year that Matt and I got married. And so we got married in October. I would have had to turn in all my paperwork in November. That would have been a fun first couple months of marriage. No. And I would have gone before the board in March, and then, that would have been the process. And I ended up having to wait a year. And as devastating as it was that day, it ended up being okay. I'm here now. But things are not as bad as I thought they would be. And things worked out. And it's important for us to be able to share those things when we fail. so that other people will be able to get through them too. And then other questions to ask yourself when you've had these experiences are, how did you grow from those experiences? What did you learn about your own capacity to handle failure? I learned that I can handle more than I probably thought I could in terms of constructive criticism. And what keeps us from taking the risks we need to take in order to find courage and confidence? Those are some of the questions that can help us think through when we feel as if we failed at something, so that we can move forward and not let that failure really impact us in a negative way. One of the fears that we talked about in the book was the fear of disappointing others. This is a huge one. And I think for many of us, and many of us on the cards that we turned in wrote this down too, we have a fear of letting our kids down, fear of letting our parents, our bosses, our friends down. And Adam points to the verse, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry, as one of the verses that he focused on in this section. Talking about social media again, it's given us a platform to have instant, anonymous, and nasty, to be able to be anonymous and nasty, really, to have that without consequence, be able to say whatever we want, right? We've all seen that. We can offer reviews and unsolicited advice with little to no seeming consequence. And Adam in his book says, you have to decide whenever you're going to post something that might upset somebody or might push someone's buttons. I love this. Is your goal merely to irritate people? Or is it actually to influence them? But so often, we see these horrible comments on Facebook. We are so much more open to sharing things that we wouldn't ever say to someone's face. I mean, it's a really horrible, it can be a really horrible thing for some folks. We experience disappointment, criticism, and rejection when we don't meet people's expectations. One of the things we have to realize about this is that sometimes if someone's disappointed with us, they're right to be disappointed, because maybe we have done something wrong. And if we've done something wrong, then that allows for us to have forgiveness and reconciliation with that person. If we're open about it, if we're willing to accept that we've done something wrong or said something wrong or hurt somebody. Other times the disappointments stem from misunderstanding. And so then it's just an opportunity to clear the air. But we won't know that unless we face it and unless we are able to talk about it. In this chapter, Adam talks a lot about grace. We finally got to the grace. Whew, that's good. We're Methodists. We need to get there. And he defines grace as undeserved kindness, blessing, mercy, and love. Paul writes, God is rich in mercy. He brought us life in Christ while we were dead as a result of those things we did wrong. He did this because of his great love that he had for us. You are saved by God's grace. Grace is grace because we can't earn it. When we finally trust in this grace, this acceptance and love of God, we can stop trying to manipulate others into giving love and acceptance to us by our niceness. We can truly live and truly love, not pretending to love so that we might receive love, but by serving out of an abundance of love, freely giving without expecting anything in return. How does God's acceptance of us through grace free us from the fear of disappointing others? So in our own lives, think about that for a second. How does this fact that, it's an incredible thing to think that based on nothing that we've done, whether good or bad, that God has loved us and accepted us as God's own children, as God's own family. How does that acceptance free us from a fear of disappointing others? Or how can it? How should it? Again, we're going to disappoint people. It happens. We're human. We do things and we fall short of people's expectations. And whether those expectations are good expectations and are healthy ones or they're unhealthy ones, how does that grace free us from that fear? That's something to think about as we deal with this fear of disappointing others. And then, what practices, again, going back to this, facing your fears with faith, examining your assumptions in light of the facts, attacking your anxieties with action, and releasing your cares to God, what practices help you remember God's acceptance of you. When you're feeling down on yourself, when you feel really bad that you've disappointed somebody, what practices help you? Sure. Prayer. Very good. What else? Scripture. Devotions. Very good. I think having someone that you can share, you know, if you've disappointed someone, if you haven't lived up to their expectations, having someone that you can share that with. And to say, and to have that trusting relationship where you can say, what do I need to do about this? What do you think how should I approach it? You know, what needs to happen? What needs to happen now? So these practices are really important because we all struggle, I think, at some level with this fear of disappointing others. Courage is often given as the antonym to fear. It's just, I think that's a well-known thing. It's just kind of thought to be the opposite, but courage is not the elimination of fear. Courage is doing what we know we should do in the face of rejection, choosing not to give up in the face of criticism. And grace is the truth that when others are disappointed, even when you've truly blown it, there is one whose love and acceptance remains steadfast. So I think also remembering that courage is not the opposite of fear. It's not the absence of fear, but it is owning up and doing what we know we should do, even when we feel that we failed or disappointed someone. The next thing that Adam talks about is insignificance and feeling meaningless. And this, he said, was one of the biggest fears among younger people in his congregation, is that they wouldn't live a life that was going to be meaningful or substantial. They wouldn't leave their mark on the world. We believe that human beings are meant to make a difference. We believe that we are here for a purpose, that God has created us for a specific purpose. And this is part of who we are. This is who God made us to be. And being made in God's image means that we yearn for a purpose that is greater than ourselves. And there's this, we can see, I think, in this feeling insignificant or inadequate is a huge problem in our world today. There's so many people who are struggling with feelings of hopelessness and meaningless and despair. And I think a lot of this, not all of it, but some of it comes from this feeling of feeling insignificant and meaningless, like their lives don't have any purpose or value. And we see that all over the place, and it's becoming more and more common. There's this false idea in the world that is set out by the media, by society, that in order to live a meaningful life, we have to do something really big. But in reality, Adam says that the sum total of hundreds and thousands of small acts that we do across the course of our lives are what truly give our lives meaning. We fall into this trap of thinking that we have to do something huge. And I truly believe that this is evil at work in the world. I think that if you, devil, Satan, however you refer to the evil that's in the world, that this is one way that evil creeps into our mind and makes us think that unless we do something big, unless we make a huge name for ourselves, that we are not significant or that we are meaningless. I think that this is something that is rampant. And I don't think we always see it as such. But think about the people who have influenced you the most. Just think about someone in your life who has really had an impact on you personally. And chances are it's not Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or a president. It's not any of these people who have achieved incredible greatness in the world's eyes, right? Maybe it is a teacher, a mentor, a pastor, a friend, a family member. Someone who the world might think is just normal, but who's had such an incredible meaning on our lives, right? And I think that points to the fact that in order to be meaningful and have a successful and significant life, we don't have to do something huge with our lives. We just have to be intentional with the things that we do. And we have to do the things that we do with great love. So what if meaning and significance are not found in big accomplishments, but in a couple of dozen small things that we do every week? I think that can be a helpful way for us to think about significance and how meaningful our lives are. Because not every one of us is going to be, a big executive of a company. I don't think I'm ever going to do that, so, which is, I guess, okay. But I think that those are, I hope, some helpful thoughts. And the idea today is not that we're going to get over all of our fears. That's not the point of this class. The point of this class is to confront them and to maybe think of them in a different way and to see ourselves as God sees us and to see these fears in the way that God sees them. I think one of the most important parts of that is recognizing the universality of these fears. And whether we admit to them, I think these fears impact our lives on the day-to-day so much more than we realize. Especially these fears we're talking about today. So the last fear that we talk about this week is loneliness. We're all a bit scared of loneliness, I think. Of being alone, of being left, of not being loved or needed or cared about. Lonely hits a spot of fear in all of us, even if we don't acknowledge it. I think one of the interesting things about that Adam points out in his book is that we spend a great deal of time focused on financial security for retirement, right? That's important, right? We want to be able to retire and not be dependent on other people and be able to live lives that we enjoy in our retirement. But researchers know that the single most important indicator of happiness in retirement is not how much money we have, but the quality of our relationships. And so I think that speaks to this fear. I mean, we fear not having enough money. That's what we'll talk about next week. We'll talk about finances and how that can plague us at times. But this idea that our quality of life is based on our relationships and the people that we surround ourselves with. This idea of loneliness, it shapes us, especially at a young age, but even as we get older. It's one of the biggest reasons I imagine why peer pressure is such an issue for so many. And I don't think that fully goes away when we're adults, right? I think it may look different than it does when we're teenagers, but I think it's still very much there. One of the things that Adam points out is that there's a difference between solitude and loneliness, right? Solitude is a period of time when we go away to reflect and to be by ourselves, and that is a healthy and good thing. Versus loneliness, this feeling of having nobody, of being alone. Pop quiz, what's the first thing that was not good in Scripture? Genesis, we have all these things that God says are good, right? Day 1, creation, good. Day 2, creation, good. Humans are created, they're good. What's the first thing that God says is not good? Being alone. God has created us for relationship, and we need relationships. And so it's within us, this desire to be in relationships and this fear of being alone. Adam recognizes 3 styles of attachment. I keep doing 3. It's 3. I can count to 3, y'all. The first style is secure attachment. So this is when you find it easy to be in strong, healthy, and loving relationships. The second is anxious attachment. Fear that your mates or your friends or others don't love you as much as you love them. So you're always anxious about your relationships and how what's going to be the outcome if you're going to disappoint them, right? And then avoidant. So having been wounded in some way, we learn to cope by becoming emotionally self-sufficient and independent, not needing and perhaps even struggling to accept love and intimacy in our lives. So these are the 3 styles of attachment that we might find ourselves in at some point, and I think it changes, obviously, at different points in our lives. He talks about smartphones and the number of teenagers getting together with their friends nearly every day dropped by more than 40% from 2000 to 2015. So these make us feel really connected, but we're missing a huge component of our relationships. And that's an incredible amount. 40% in 15 years of kids connecting on this and not in person, not face-to-face. And so we have this air, this idea that we are so much more connected now when really we aren't. And one thing, a side note about smartphones and social media especially, is that you always see the good parts of people's lives, right? You always see their vacations. You always see, like, you know, they're in some wonderful restaurant. They put a picture of their food up there, and you're like, oh man, I'm eating, you know, macaroni and cheese. And it's so, it can be so isolating for us. And I think one thing that we need to remember is that other people are posting those pictures, and it's okay to post of your vacation, obviously. You know, if you're having, it's good to share those memories. But one thing to realize is that everyone who is posting those pictures is just as afraid of the same things as we are. Fear of failing, fear of disappointing others, fear of not living up to expectations, right? That's why people post all these incredible, you know, their big trips, all these things, always seeming like their lives are perfect. Because they don't want people to know that they struggle, right? I think when we recognize that, I think it can be really helpful as we approach social media. So this issue of loneliness, it means that, again, that we have to take risks, right? Safe risks. Obviously, it seems as, you know, it's becoming increasingly less safe for women, especially, to go out into the world and try to meet people, right? I mean, it's a reality that we live in, but we have to take risks, and we have to be willing to reach out. And we have to be willing to share parts of ourselves and our failures and our fears and all these things to have those true and meaningful relationships. Because God created us for relationships. Oftentimes our fear of rejection, our fear of disappointing, our fear of insignificance keep us from opening up to people. And all of these fears build upon each other and come from a place of fear of not feeling validated or important, just as we are, as God made us to be. In closing, I want to read Psalm 139. This is verse 5 and 7 through 10. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Where can I go to flee from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take to the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. God has created us in God's image, and we seek to live lives of purpose and meaning. God intends for us to be happy and healthy in our relationship with others. God knows that we're not perfect. God knows we're going to fail. God knows we're going to struggle. And so God grants grace, and more grace every day to us. And Jesus does set the example of how to live a meaningful life through acts of love, both small and large. And what I can say about all of these things and all of these fears is just, again, to remind us that I think at some level we all struggle with them, even if we don't admit it. And they are not often the first fears we admit to, but they drive nearly every action that we do or do not take in our lives. We must have the courage to live even in the midst of our fear, trusting that God will be with us and that God and others will offer us grace as we go through life. Let's pray. God, we thank you for creating us in your image. We thank you for creating us with the desire to live into our purpose and to live meaningful lives. God, at some level we all struggle with a fear of failure, a fear of disappointing others, a fear of a life that is not meaningful, or a fear of loneliness. God, as we go through life, remind us of what your word says to us. Remind us that we have your grace. Remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but it is the ability to live and to thrive and to do the right thing, even in the midst of our fears. God, I thank you for this group, and I thank you for this journey. I thank you that we can come together to talk about our fears and not necessarily to find a quick fix for them, God, but to just be reminded of who we are and whose we are. I pray now that you bless us as we go into worship, and that you keep us until we meet next week. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. There you